Come to me, I'll see you all right. And it was a wonderful thing to do because this stuff wouldn't have found its way into the museums if that hadn't happened.
Over the years, literally hundreds of swords, daggers and other precious items have been dredged from the fens here. They range in date from the prehistoric period right through to the 14th century. Now, this wasn't some localized Fenland cult, but part of a much larger belief system. They're still being found today.
We've been out here every weekend, more or less, since August, and look at how many people have turned up. They've walked a lot of their parish already. They've found some fantastic sites over there, of course, just through field walking. If they hadn't done it, we'd never know about them. Although individually you might not have thought that you were finding very much, but put all together we've found nearly 2,000 separate objects now.
And that's an Iron Age axe, part of the shaft still there.
Again, you so rarely see them.
1858.
That's a Viking axe and a made for splitting heads.
This extraordinary, complete Iron Age spear shaft.
It's the longest in Europe. Medieval iron swords. A masterpiece. The Witham shield's not really useful as a shield. As with much of this, it's a ritual piece. Although we find weapons, we're finding tools as well. The great and the good and the everyday people, I think, coming together in this activity.
It wasn't until recently that archaeologists began to notice a pattern in the location of these objects.
Throughout the valley there are these slightly higher sandbanks and ridges.
These were the remains of ancient causeways, which once formed part of this extraordinary landscape. The Witham Valley stretches in a long, thin line up to the city of Lincoln. Until these fens were drained in the 1780s, the Witham would have sprawled all over the low-lying land, weaving a network of islands and marshes. Local people moved around the fens on a series of wooden causeways. The weapons were always discovered near these causeways. At first it was assumed they were accidentally dropped or lost in battle. In fact, there is a far more mysterious explanation.
People were visiting the river, using the river, and for whatever reason, they were leaving this sort of material. The spear could have been used in the river, but it seems to have been given to the river.
And I like the idea of them being given and returned to the waters, perhaps.
And these medieval iron swords, the sword theme does actually go all the way through millennia.
For hundreds of years, weapons have been deliberately thrown from these causeways into the water. I believe that the story of King Arthur receiving his sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake is a direct reference to this ancient British tradition. But the Arthurian legends were written much later, long after these ancient religious ideas were supposedly wiped out by the Romans and Christianity. How on earth did they survive? The Witham had one more secret to reveal. This area of Fenland has one of the highest concentrations of monastic sites anywhere in Britain. There can be no practical need for so many abbeys in such a small area. So why was the early medieval church building here with such extraordinary fervour? The narrow 10-mile stretch of the Witham Valley is scattered with the remains of 14 abbeys. Every one of these abbeys is built at the end of an ancient causeway.
We found it really difficult to understand why there should be 14 church sites, all lined up for 10 miles, along the edge of the Witham Valley.
Historians Dave Stocker and Paul Everson don't think that this is a coincidence.
The abbey we are standing on is on an island. You find there's only one way to get here, and it's along a causeway.
It seems odd that a causeway should determine where you're going to put an abbey.
You've got to bear in mind that to cross any sort of body of water, but particularly to cross a fen by boat, was a dangerous matter. And in order to make it a successful crossing, you had to offer some sort of piety, some sort of, call it superstition, but it was a sort of folk superstition which was bound up with religion.
The weapons and the water into which they were being placed had significance for the people of ancient Britain.
Swords weren't just a weapon. The sword is a great symbol of authority, which is distributed outwards from lords to their tenants as a badge of office. Once the tenant dies, that sword has to go back to the lord, and that's attested in many Anglo-Saxon wills. Now, imagine that you're a king and you haven't got a lord, or at least not on earth. And in the Arthur story, of course, it's the Spirit of the Lake, it's the Lady of the Lake, who is the guardian of Britain.
The story of the Lady in the Lake echoes the ancient tradition of depositing weapons in water. The medieval authors who wrote these tales knew about such traditions because Christianity had not killed them off, but had kept them alive.
When were the last swords going in?
The latest one is 14th century. And interestingly enough, that's precisely the same moment at which swords and indeed whole body armour tend to start being hung up in churches over burials of lords.
I mean, it sounds to me, looking at it as a prehistorian, that actually what some of these chaps in the abbeys are doing sounds awfully sort of pagan to me.
Pope Gregory has said, I don't want you knocking down these pagan temples, I want you converting the pagan idols. Water is the one connecting thread. The Bronze Age barrows were by the water. The causeways crossed the water. The swords are put into the water. So the one connecting thread of all this is water.
And do you suppose that might be a reason why that fantastic cathedral over there is placed right by the River Witham?
I have very little doubt that that's the case. The first name for Lincoln is Indo-Colne, city by the pool. Nicor is what the Normans tended to call the place. And the word Nicor means water spirit.
The story of the Witham is one of continuity. It suggests that deep-rooted ideas that began in prehistory continued well into the medieval period. This clashes with what I learnt at school, where the first 1,000 years of British history were a series of massive invasions. Indeed, the first of these, the Roman invasion, may not have been a tale about a boy and a magical sword. I found evidence that ancient British traditions survived the Roman invasion. A new series of archaeological discoveries are beginning to rewrite the story of the Roman invasion of Britain. This elegant mosaic decorated the floor of one of the most luxurious buildings in Roman Britain. But this was not the overseas residence of some extravagant Roman governor, but the home of a wealthy, Romanized Brit. Fishbourne Palace is the largest building ever excavated in Roman Britain. Martin Hennig helped excavate the gardens.
It was absolutely amazing. Digging along, your trowel couldn't help sinking in, and you were actually uncovering the bedding trenches, probably for box. You can see similar gardens on a much smaller scale if you go to Pompeii.
On a smaller scale?
Yes. What you've got here is something that's equivalent to the palaces of the greatest Roman aristocrats.
Fishbourne covers a larger area than Buckingham Palace. 160 stone columns support the roof, which is constructed from 100 tons of imported Italian tiles. Corridors surround over 100 rooms, some of which are decorated with elaborate mosaics. When Fishbourne was discovered, it was assumed that this was a palace of a Roman governor, a symbol of the imperial regime that had been forced on Britain. But during excavations, archaeologists came across a gold signet ring with an unusual inscription, the seal of Tiberius Claudius Catuarus. The ring belonged to a wealthy Briton. But what was it doing at Fishbourne? To understand why a Briton might be living in a Roman palace, we must look again at the events leading up to the invasion of AD 43. Maybe because we haven't been invaded since 1066, we British have a simplistic attitude towards invasions. We see them as being inevitably oppressive. So we imagine that when the Romans arrived, they wiped out British culture and customs. But in actual fact, it wasn't a straightforward process of colonization. Archaeologists are starting to radically rethink the Roman invasion of Britain. I would imagine the Britons faced by the might of Rome would have been quaking in their boots.
I don't think it was quite that. The previous attempt to invade Britain was that of the bad and mad Emperor Caligula, who had marched a large army up to the Channel coast. He then put all his catapults in a row, and they fired enormous rocks into the sea. After a time, he told them that he had won a great victory over Neptune. You can imagine how that got about. The great Roman Empire was run by a lot of Charlies, and